You know that feeling when you suddenly see, like, the hidden structure in something, like cracking a code, and suddenly everything looks different?
Yeah, absolutely.
What if you could do that with, well, everything? Stories, language, fashion, even how we think about who we are.
That's kind of the promise, isn't it?
Right. What if culture itself, from ancient myths right up to whatever's trending now, has a kind of secret grammar underneath it all?
That's exactly what we're getting into today. We're doing a deep dive into structuralism,
Okay.
which is this really powerful way of thinking that kind of flips the script on how we understand meaning.
Flips the script how?
Well, it suggests meaning isn't just in something inherently, or just in our heads.
Yeah.
It argues that meaning actually bubbles up from these underlying systems, these relationships between things.
Interesting. And we've got some sources to help us unpack this, right? Videos covering the origins, the key thinkers, the implications.
Yeah, a good selection. The goal is really to get inside this complex idea, see how it changes the way we look at the world, and figure out why it matters.
Sounds good. Where does it all start? You mentioned language earlier.
It really does. Everything kind of flows from linguistics, surprisingly enough.
Okay, so who's the key figure there? Who got this structuralist ball rolling?
You really have to begin with Ferdinand de Saussure. He was a Swiss linguist, late 19th, early 20th century. His ideas basically laid the groundwork.
But people studied language before him, obviously. What did he do that was so different?
That's true. Before Saussure, a lot of linguistics was, well, historical. Diachronic, they call it.
Diachronic.
Yeah, studying how languages changed over time, tracking word origins, how grammar shifted,
Yeah.
like watching a history documentary of a language, sped up.
Okay, so tracing roots back through centuries.
Exactly. But Saussure said, hang on, let's try looking at language synchronically.
Synchronically.
Yeah, like, let's freeze time. Look at language as a complete system working right now. How do all the pieces fit together and relate to each other in this moment, this snapshot?
Ah, okay. So less like watching the movie of language history, more like analyzing a single complex photograph of it.
That's a great way to put it. And this is where he drops the bombshell idea, the one that really underpins structuralism.
Okay, I'm ready.
Saussure said language, the words we use. It's mostly arbitrary.
Arbitrary. How so? That sounds wrong somehow.
I know, it feels counterintuitive, but it means there's no natural inherent connection between the word itself, the sound, the written letters, what he called the signifier,
You're right.
and the actual concept or thing it points to, the signified.
Wait, so the sound tree, or writing, T-R-E-E, has literally nothing inherently tree-like about it. Zero connection to the big leafy thing.
Basically, yes.
Yeah.
Think about it. The meaning isn't in the sound tree. We, as a language community, have just sort of agreed over time that this sound or these letters will stand for that concept. It's convention, a social contract.
I guess. If it wasn't arbitrary, all languages would have pretty similar words for tree, wouldn't they?
Exactly, and they obviously don't. The sources give some great examples, like that dog demo one,
Oh, yeah.
where they show you can basically teach any arbitrary sound, like hob, to mean do you want food? Just through repetition and agreement. There's nothing food-related about hob.
Okay. Or like traffic lights. Red doesn't feel like stop in some deep way. Green doesn't scream go.
Right. We just learned the code, the system. Same with those stick figures on washroom doors. They don't look exactly like anyone, but we know the convention within that sign system.
So meaning is agreed upon, conventional, not inherent. But is it just about linking one word to one thing?
Not entirely. Saussure added another layer.
Yeah.
He said meaning also comes crucially from difference, from differentiation.
Difference.
Yeah. A word gets its meaning not just by pointing to a concept, but by being different from all the other words in the system.
Okay, like that guess who analogy someone mentioned. You figure out who someone is by ruling out who they aren't.
Exactly that. A tree means tree, partly because it isn't a bush, it isn't grass, it isn't a flower, it isn't a lake. Its meaning is defined by its contrast with everything else around it in the language system.
Wow.
It's relational.
Wow, okay. That's a big idea. Meaning is defined as much by what something isn't as by what it is.
It really is. And this leads him to distinguish between Lang and parole.
Lang and parole.
Lang is the underlying system. The abstract rules, the grammar, the vocabulary, the whole shared structure of the language that the community implicitly agrees on.
Like the dictionary and grammar rules all rolled into one abstract concept.
Kind of, yeah. And parole is any specific individual act of using that language.
Yeah.
A sentence someone speaks, something someone writes. An utterance.
Okay. Lang is the system. Parole is the specific usage.
Right. And the key is, the meaning of any individual act of parole doesn't just come from itself. It only makes sense because it plugs into the larger system, the lang. Your sentence means something because of its relationship to the whole structure.
And this is where things get really interesting, right? Because thinkers looked at Saussure's language stuff and thought, hang on.
Exactly. They have this light bulb moment. What if culture works the same way?
Yeah.
What if myths, fashion, literature, social rituals, what if they're all like languages?
Meaning they're systems where meaning comes from relationships and underlying structures, not just from the things themselves.
Precisely. The idea is that a cultural item, a myth, a piece of clothing, a story, doesn't have its meaning locked inside it. Its meaning is generated by its place within a larger cultural system, by the underlying rules and how it relates to other elements in that system.
So a specific outfit someone wears only means something because of how it relates to the whole language of fashion at that time.
You got it. Remember that recipe versus dish analogy from the sources?
Yeah, I like that one.
The recipe is the lang. It's the underlying structure, the rules, the ingredients for making, say, lasagna.
Right.
The actual lasagna you cook in your kitchen, following those rules, maybe tweaking them a bit, that's the parole. It's one specific instance.
And my specific lasagna only makes sense as lasagna because it relates back to that shared recipe system, the lang of lasagna making.
Exactly. Now, when we talk about applying structuralism to culture, it's not all monolithic. One source brought up Robert Skol's distinction between low and high structuralism, which is pretty helpful.
Okay, low and high. What's low structuralism about?
Low structuralism, sometimes called poetics, is more focused on digging into the text itself, especially narratives, to find the underlying grammar or structure within it.
Okay, so looking for patterns inside the story. And this is where Vladimir Propp comes in with his fairy tales.
Perfect example. Propp took like 100 Russian folktales. On the surface, they all seem totally different heroes, villains, magical objects.
Right, endless variations.
But he analyzed them and found this incredible underlying pattern. He identified 31 recurring plot elements, or functions, he called them. Things like a prohibition is violated, the villain causes harm, the hero acquires a magical agent, the hero returns.
Wow, 31 recurring elements.
And the really amazing part wasn't just finding these functions, but discovering they tended to show up in the same order, more or less, across all these different tales, like a structural template for folk tales.
So, like grammar in a sentence. The dog chased the ball, the man read the paper. Different words, different meanings, but subject-verb-object structure underneath.
That's a perfect analogy. Propp found the narrative equivalent of SVO. The characters and details, the parole changed, but the underlying functional sequence, the lang, remained remarkably consistent.
Okay, so low structuralism, finding the deep grammar inside the text. What about high structuralism, then?
High structuralism zooms out. It's less about just the internal structure of one text and more about how meaning is generated through semantic relationships, by referencing the broader cultural system, the codes outside the text.
Semantic relationships. That connects back to Saussure's idea about meaning coming from difference in what something isn't.
Exactly. High structuralism really runs with that. Meaning depends heavily on what's not there, on the context, on the expectations set up by the wider culture.
Okay.
Think about that example. The cat hissed at the mouse. Pretty normal, right?
Yeah.
The cat hissed at the lion. Suddenly more interesting. Maybe scary for the cat.
Right.
The cat hissed at the vacuum cleaner. Now it's potentially funny, or at least familiar if you own a cat. The meaning changes based on the object, sure, but it also changes because of our unspoken cultural expectation that the default hissing target is probably a mouse. The absence of the expected mouse shapes how we interpret the presence of the vacuum cleaner.
Ah, I get it. The cultural background noise, the expectations, they shape the meaning of the specific thing happening.
Precisely. So applied to culture, a text or an event gets its full meaning not just from its internal bits, but from how it plugs into the whole web of ideas, values, and codes floating around in that culture.
The cultural lang.
You could say that. An individual cultural text, a parole, only really resonates or makes sense by tapping into that wider system of cultural codes. Thinkers like Roland Barthes were masters at showing this.
Right, which brings us to key figures in high structuralism, like Claude Lévi-Strauss and Barthes himself.
Definitely. Lévi-Strauss was an anthropologist. He took these ideas and applied them to myths from all sorts of different cultures.
What did he find?
He argued that even though myths look wildly different on the surface, they often reveal similar underlying structures of human thought. He saw them as ways societies grapple with fundamental questions or tensions. often expressed through binary opposites.
Binary opposites like...
Like nature versus culture, raw versus cooked, life versus death, male versus female. He suggested, for example, that the whole Oedipus myth complex might be a way ancient Greek society was unconsciously working through deep anxieties about human origins. Are we born from the earth, autochthonously, or are we born from the union of man and woman? The myth plays out these opposing ideas.
Trying to resolve contradictions through narrative structure.
Kind of, yeah. Or at least exploring them. And then you have Roland Barthes, who took this kind of analysis everywhere. Wrestling, ads, fashion, literature.
He was the one looking for cultural codes, right?
Exactly. Those shared bits of knowledge or assumptions that a culture uses as shorthand. Like that example from the source. Someone doodling in class. The act itself is simple, but the cultural code immediately tells us it signifies boredom or inattentiveness in that context. The meaning isn't in the doodle, it's in the code.
And the most famous example, the one the sources really highlight, is his analysis of that Paris match cover.
Yeah, it's a classic structuralist reading. So the cover shows a young black soldier in a French army uniform saluting the French flag.
Okay, simple image description.
But Barthes looked at the context. This is post-WWII France, dealing with its colonial empire, facing calls for decolonization, grappling with national identity. He argued that within that specific cultural system, the image becomes loaded with extra meaning. It's not just a soldier saluting.
It's making a statement because of those cultural codes.
Precisely. Barthes argued it functioned as a powerful piece of mythology, essentially. It implicitly countered arguments against French colonialism by showing a black subject seemingly willingly participating in and showing loyalty to the French imperial project.
So it suggests unity, that the colonies are still part of France, that service transcends race.
Exactly. It becomes a statement about the legitimacy and reach of the French Empire, suggesting loyalty and shared identity, pushing back against narratives of oppression or the desire for independence. That's the argument Barthes makes based on the cultural codes of the time.
And the structuralist point is crucial here. The meaning arises because it is a black soldier. If it had been a white soldier, the photo would have signified something entirely different or much less complex. The meaning comes from that difference within the system of potential signs.
You nailed it. The meaning is generated by its position within that whole system of signs and cultural codes active in France at that moment.
Okay, so let's try and synthesize this. Pulling together Saussure, Propp, Lévi-Strauss, Barthes. What's the absolute core takeaway of structuralism?
I think the really central and pretty radical argument is this, meaning identity, even consciousness itself. They aren't fixed, inherent things. They don't come from some higher spiritual plane, and they don't just spring fully formed from the individual mind.
Okay. So where do they come from?
They are products. Products of underlying systems, structures, often material ones, that operate beneath the surface.
That feels like a massive departure from, say, philosophy before that.
Oh, absolutely. It overturned centuries of thinking. It challenged Plato's idea of eternal forms providing meaning, and it challenged Descartes' focus on the individual thinking subject, I think, therefore I am, as the foundation. Structuralism basically says you think, and who you are and what things mean is largely shaped by the structures you're embedded in.
And we saw hints of this before, structuralism proper, right? People like Marx arguing economic structures shape everything, or Freud saying the unconscious structures the conscious mind.
Yes, exactly. Marx and Freud are often pointed to as proto-structuralists, looking for those deep, determining, often hidden systems. And the structures structuralism focuses on are generally seen as unconscious, we're not aware of them, materialistic, based in real-world systems, and pretty deterministic. They strongly shape outcomes.
And they work through relationships and differences, not inherent qualities, like the ones in Urzo on a CD you mentioned.
Perfect analogy. A single 1 or 0 means nothing musically.
Right.
It's the pattern, the sequence, the relationship between them that creates the structure we hear as music. Same for the ACTG, bases in DNA. Their sequence and relation determines the biological structure.
Wow. The implications then are huge across so many fields. It really pushed for a more analytical, almost scientific way to study the humanities, literature, art, culture.
It definitely did. It encouraged looking for objective patterns, codes, systems, rather than relying solely on subjective interpretation or just tracking historical influence. Though, as one source noted, some critics felt this could be reductive, like it was draining the humanity from the humanities by making everything seem like a cold mechanism.
Making it too mechanical.
Yeah, but you can't deny its influence. Even things like personality tests that try to categorize people based on underlying traits owe something to this structuralist way of thinking about hidden systems.
But like any major intellectual movement, it wasn't without its flaws or critics.
Not at all. And there are some interesting ironies, aren't there?
Like what?
Well, structuralists argue passionately that meaning isn't derived from human desire or subjectivity. Yet the whole project seems driven by a very human desire to organize everything, to find a universal system.
Huh. Good point. And they tear down old centers of meaning, God, the self, only to kind of install structure as the new all-powerful center.
Exactly. And there's this slight awkwardness of using language, which they themselves argue is arbitrary and conventional, to build this whole elaborate theory, arguing against inherent meaning. It gets a bit circular.
So what's considered the biggest weakness, the main limitation?
Probably the most pointed critique is that the structuralism is really good at explaining the how systems function, how meaning gets constructed through these relationships and codes, but it often falls short on explaining the why.
Ah, like that John Lennox analogy about the boiling kettle.
Precisely. Structuralism can give you the scientific explanation. The water is boiling because the heat energy is agitating the water molecules, the structural mechanism.
Right.
But it doesn't explain why the kettle is on in the first place, which is because I wanted a cup of tea, the why, the agent's intention.
So it struggles with human agency, with purpose, with free will. If structures determine everything.
That's the crux of it. Where does change come from? How can individuals break out of the structure or create something truly new if we're just products of the system?
And I suppose as the world became more globalized, cultures started blending more, those supposedly stable cultural codes got a lot more fluid and harder to pin down.
That definitely desocialized things. And all these critiques, the limitations, the changing world, they paved the way for what came next, which was largely post-structuralism, building on but also reacting against these structuralist ideas.
Okay, so quite a journey. We started with Saussure turning linguistics inside out, seeing language as this system of arbitrary signs and differences.
Then saw how that got applied to culture, finding narrative grammars with Propp, analyzing myths and cultural codes with Lévi-Strauss and Barthes.
Understanding that core structuralist claim, meaning emerges from underlying systems, not inherent qualities, and then grappling with the huge impact, but also the significant critiques.
It really is a lens that, once you start using it, makes you see things differently. You start noticing the patterns, the unspoken codes, relationships that generate meaning all around you in films, books, ads, social media, everywhere.
It definitely leaves you with something to chew on. That final thought. If our understanding, our meaning, even our sense of self is so deeply shaped by these arbitrary signs, these cultural conventions, these underlying structures, how much of what you think and feel is genuinely uniquely you, and how much is just a reflection of the systems you happen to be swimming in?
Yeah, that's one to ponder on your own deep dives.